Reborn in Blood by Deborah L. Davitt. Earthen maw that gapes open, ready, and waits patiently to be fed with flesh and soul's breath. Waters dream in darkness, and through them we touch gods, and thus heed them. Down into the depths like a star she falls now, breaks the surface, body so clean and perfect, fitting sacrifice, but now shattered, torn, rent. But can she hear them? Dying, can she perceive what others cannot? Passing into stillness and silence vast, she must, and be born again to this busy world, though the pain racks. Copper hands breach mirror-like surface, obsidian well, gateway to the spirit realm. Gasping, crying out for our aid, she's reborn and renewed. What have old gods whispered in her ears? Secrets cloud her eyes, and her broken voice can scarce be heard as she speaks truths which cannot be borne. Not for us the wisdom of ancient peoples. Madness fills us up like old blood, and when we wake from it, brass shells litter the ground here. Smell of cordite, incense new and strange, to please the gods we woke from their long sleep. Blood and black earth, exalting their names. Flee the gods' hunger? Effort vain and fruitless, for they are jaguars stalking urban wilds. Blood scent drives them. They will find us, make us servants, or perhaps further sacrifices. We are deer. They are perfect predators who suck human life. And now we, like those whose lives passed on the jungle's boughs before, must serve. Well, I write a lot of different things. I write short stories and I write novels, and poetry is one of the many things that I write. And sometimes I wake up with a word in my head, the way I sometimes wake up with a song already playing in my head. And it's basically stuck there until I use the word just to get rid of it. So sometimes a poem is inspired by that word that's just burning there. And sometimes I'll read either amazing science news stories or about archaeological finds, and it's not enough for a short story, but it'll make a damn good poem. And sometimes I just find an image that speaks to me, and a poem sort of flows out of the image, and out of that and a blend of life experiences. They do say to write what you know, and that's the stuff that I know. In this particular case, this is about Mayan mythology, in particular cenotes. Cenotes are huge sinkholes in the limestone that have lakes at the bottom, which were, in Mayan mythology, gateways to the underworld, to the land of the gods. They used to throw treasured possessions in there as sacrifices, and apparently the occasional person too. And I sort of imagined what that would be like if somebody wanted to revive that kind of sacrifice in the modern world, and what might happen. Well, this one was sort of an experiment. I like to write form poetry just as much as I like to write free verse, and this is a type of poem called Sapphic Verse, named for the poet Sappho back in ancient Greek times. And its structure is derived from the number of stresses and the pattern of stresses per line. So it's not about rhyme, and it's not about anything else but meter. And I find this actually to be one of the most difficult forms I've ever done. I would rather sit down and tangle with a really complicated Welsh rhyming form than ever write one of these again. They are really hard. I've only ever written 2 Sapphic verses. So in short, I had the picture of what I wanted to write about in my head. I wanted to be writing about cenotes and ancient gods and things like that. So I had to write down the pattern of stresses and unstressed syllables, give myself a little framework, and I was starting to map words onto the framework in like a Word document. And the rest is, when I'm writing a form poem, you have to keep your mind a little bit loose because the form is your co-pilot. You might not wind up writing exactly what you thought you were going to write, but when the form is helping you, you sometimes wind up someplace much more interesting than you would have wound up if you didn't have the form. So you have to kind of play it a little bit loose, even though the form is dictating some of the things for you. Well, I I'd say, first of all, relax. Nobody expects you to be Shakespeare, and if an editor expects you to be Shakespeare, you probably don't need to submit to that editor. Find inspiration where you can in a delightfully strange word, in a piece of news, in your own life experiences. And like I was just saying, if you're using a form, let it be your co-pilot, not a straitjacket. Because again, you might wind up someplace really interesting by letting the interplay of the form work with your ideas. That's a really good question. I used to teach English, but I taught it at the college level, and I was mostly teaching people how to write. I wasn't teaching them how to read poetry. But unfortunately, as a result of a lot of our education systems, I think pretty much worldwide, there's sort of the sense that poetry is this cultural artifact that should be under glass, and the only people who are allowed to really understand it are the people who approach the poem that's under the glass case with like their white gloves on, and they're only allowed to interface with the haiku or the sonnet, with tweezers or something like that. No. Poetry is supposed to be joyous, or it's supposed to be an interactive experience. So keep your mind loose and look for the author's intention is what my advice would be. Some people, every author, regardless of what they're writing, has an intention. If you're writing a blog post, it's probably to inform or to move somebody or to motivate them. If you're writing a political speech, you're trying to raise people to action. If you're writing poetry, you might be writing for political reasons. You might be writing to be direct. You might be writing as a puzzle for the mind. You might be trying to rouse somebody's emotions. Every author has an intention. So you're going to want to find what that intention is, and that's going to guide you through the poem. And then after that, once you get a little better acquainted with poetry, you can find the genre of poetry that appeals to you. I write a lot of speculative poetry, which is science fiction and fantasy poetry. It's a whole genre. If you like, reading fantasy and science fiction, there's poetry out there for you. If you like older works, if you already like reading antique works, there are hundreds and thousands of poems that are already out there ready and waiting for you to read them. And if you like intellectual puzzles and you like almost like CSI or criminology or things like that, you might have the kind of mind that likes a poem that's more of a puzzle. You'll find the right fit for you because there's almost as many different types of poems as there are people. I had to really think about this question when you first posed it to me. But one of the few poems that I can quote from just off the top of my head is a poem called Invictus by William Ernest Henley. I read it for the first time when I was 17 or so, and I know that the author dealt with chronic pain and illness throughout his life back in the 19th century. And the defiance of the lines has stuck with me through the years and sort of how I try to lead my life, at least a little bit. And the quote that always comes to mind for me is, "No matter how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." And that's always meant to me that no matter what life throws at you, you define how you respond to it. And so that's always meant a lot to me, and it's one of the ones that always just sticks in my head. So it's not the one that most people would quote, because somebody would always want to quote Shakespeare or Keats or someone like that. No, I like this Victorian dude, and just that one poem. Certainly. If you like science fiction and fantasy poetry, there is an entire organization of us called the Speculative Fiction and Fantasy Organization, the SFPA. Our president is a gentleman named Brian Tawara. We all write in really fun works. I have a friend named Michelle Munzler, who's the person who got me into writing poetry, and she's a wonderful speculative poet. You should definitely take a look at all our wonderful things.